Auckland is the largest port city in New Zealand, attracting many Chinese people to live and do business thanks to its hustle and bustle and pleasant temperate climate. The east of the city is home to many luxury villas, including Sunny Hills, a famous peaceful and safe area. However, in 2020, a tragic murder occurred here, and the main victim was a wealthy and famous Chinese businesswoman who was admired by many people. On November 28, 2020, a weekend like any other in Sunny Hills, but a woman named Wu was living in a state of anxiety. Recently, her close friend, Ms. Zhong, also known as Elizabeth Zhong, often confided in her about the difficulties in life. The company's business was losing money to the point of declaring bankruptcy, causing her spirit to decline significantly. Today, the two had arranged to meet, but it was past the time, and she still could not contact her friend. Her repeated calls only received an alarming silence, which had never happened before. Concerned for her friend's well-being, Mrs. Wu drove to Ms. Zhong's mansion in Sunny Hills. After repeatedly ringing the doorbell with no response, she used her spare key to enter. In the eerie silence of the house, Mrs. Wu searched every corner, hoping to find her friend. Upon entering the bedroom, she discovered blood stains and noticed that the surveillance system had been disabled. Her worry now turned to genuine fear, prompting her to immediately contact the police. As soon as the police received the report, they quickly arrived at the scene and began investigating. The first notable thing they discovered was that the entire security camera system in the house had been intentionally sabotaged. In this situation, the investigators could only reassure Ms. Wu that it was possible that her friend had driven himself to a hospital and that they would conduct a search of all medical facilities in the area. However, Ms. Wu could not believe this explanation in her heart. She knew her friend's personality very well, and no matter what happened, Ms. Zhong would never stay silent when she called her like this. The next evening, on a quiet street not far from the mansion, a resident noticed a Range Rover SUV that had been parked outside his house all day. What caught his attention were blood stains beside the vehicle. He promptly alerted the police. Officers arrived, collected blood samples as evidence, and initially left. 2 hours later, a night shift officer decided to break the car's window to investigate. Inside the messy vehicle, they found a suitcase in the trunk, covered with blankets and down pillows. Upon opening it, they were hit by a horrific smell and made a gruesome discovery: the body of a woman. The victim had been stabbed over 20 times in the head, neck, and back. There was a 7-inch wound across her neck that had nearly severed her head from her body. In a short time, investigators identified the unfortunate victim, Ms. Zhong, the woman who had been reported missing the day before. News of the case quickly spread, causing a deep shock in the Chinese community in Auckland. No one could believe that such a horrific murder had happened in Sunny Hills, a villa area known as the most secure place in the city. Through preliminary investigation, the police determined that this was not a simple case, but was full of revenge. It is noteworthy that the perpetrator seemed to be someone familiar with the victim, because the perpetrator was able to enter and exit the villa naturally without attracting any attention. The perpetrator's method was also extremely bold when he dared to use the victim's own car to dispose of the body, a move calculated to prolong the time and make it difficult for the investigation process. In addition, according to Ms. Wu, all of Ms. Zhong's electronic devices, including her phone, laptop, and computer, disappeared without a trace after the incident. This further strengthens the theory that the perpetrator had meticulously planned his cruel act. Ms. Zhong was born in 1965 in China. From a young age, she stood out for her extraordinary intelligence and agility, becoming the pride of her entire family. With ambitions to reach out to the world, she devoted herself to improving her English as a student, as if she had foreseen her future path in distant horizons. After graduating from university, she began her career at the Shenzhen Stock Exchange. It was here that fate brought her not only professional success, but also a special relationship. During a business meeting, she met Mr. Fu, who would later become her husband. The young woman's intellectual beauty and grace captivated Mr. Fu from their first encounter. Their relationship progressed quickly, leading to marriage. The young couple's happiness was made complete with the birth of their first daughter. Their small family became an ideal model of fulfillment, admired and envied by many. During China's period of reform and development, with their experience and acumen in stock trading, the Zhongs accumulated substantial wealth. In 1997, after building considerable capital in their homeland, the couple discussed and decided to move their daughter abroad. After carefully considering various options, including Canada and Australia, the family chose to settle in New Zealand. Like many Chinese families, they selected Auckland as the starting point for their new life. With her adaptability and business acumen, she not only integrated into the new lifestyle, but also skillfully built an extensive network of connections. Within just 3 years of settling, she established her own business college. From its first class, the school attracted over 100 students, an impressive achievement for any new educational institution. This success wasn't surprising, as Mrs. Zhong was known for her dynamic personality, exceptional talent, and particularly her compelling persuasiveness. Under her skilled management, the school continued to grow, bringing her significant income. However, as fate would have it, business disputes began to emerge, and eventually, the school was forced to close. Undaunted by this setback, Mrs. Zhong quickly sought new opportunities. Her career entered a new chapter when she accepted a senior management position at a major corporation. With her talent and dedication, she achieved considerable success during her 9-year tenure there. Yet, with her ambitious spirit and grand aspirations, Mrs. Zhong once again decided to change her career direction in 2010. This time, she boldly ventured into immigration consulting, a daring but shrewd decision. By frequently traveling between China and New Zealand, she became an effective bridge for Chinese entrepreneurs looking to invest in the land of Kiwis. Her tireless efforts were quickly rewarded with substantial profits, once again proving her exceptional business acumen. In 2013, while attending a seminar, Mrs. Zhong happened to meet Fang Sun, an entrepreneur 8 years her junior. During their social conversations, they surprisingly discovered they were from the same hometown. This connection of shared roots quickly drew them closer, creating a special relationship. At that time, Fang Sun was a successful businessman living in China, intending to relocate his family abroad. After their first meeting, he frequently traveled to New Zealand on business pretexts, seeking opportunities to meet Mrs. Zhong more often. Gradually, the line between friendship and business began to blur, giving way to a deeper relationship. Ironically, their close business partnership meant that neither of their spouses suspected anything about their frequent meetings. To facilitate business cooperation with Mrs. Zhong, in 2014, Fang Sun moved his wife and children to New Zealand. His family stayed at Mrs. Zhong's mansion for an extended period. In late 2014, Fang Sun invested capital with Mrs. Zhong to establish Sunbo Company. They subsequently founded 3 more companies in New Zealand and invested approximately $17.5 million in various local businesses. Mrs. Zhong wasn't just skilled in business, she was also adept at social networking. She built close relationships with many senior government officials in New Zealand. She accompanied high-level leaders on business trips to major Chinese cities to attract investment. This close cooperation with the government made Mrs. Zhong's business increasingly prosperous. The Sunbo company she managed sometimes generated profits in the hundreds of millions of dollars. Beyond that, she continued to acquire other businesses, including the film company DigiPost, and owned 2 vineyards, Kennedy Point and Carrick. This resounding success turned Mrs. Zhong into a well-known businesswoman and tycoon within the Chinese community in New Zealand. In the eyes of many, Mrs. Zhong was always seen as the ideal model of a successful, talented, dynamic, kind-hearted woman, always ready to help others. However, happiness did not last long for Mrs. Zhong. As if fate were playing a cruel joke, everything she painstakingly built collapsed like a house of cards in less than 2 years. Not only did her flourishing career face serious setbacks, but her family's happiness also teetered on the brink of disaster. In 2019, her marriage to Mr. Fu officially ended. The cause was Mr. Fu's suspicion that his wife's relationship with Fang Sun had crossed the line of mere friendship. After heated arguments, Mr. Fu reported to the police and requested DNA testing on their shared bed to prove Fang Sun's presence. In response, Mrs. Zhong did not stand idly by. She immediately reported to the police regarding Mr. Fu's unlawful trespassing and mental harassment. As the house was owned by Sunbo, where Mrs. Zhong held the ownership, the police quickly confirmed Mr. Fu's criminal behavior. He ended up facing prison time. After a short stint behind bars, Mr. Fu agreed to the divorce, prompting Mrs. Zhong to withdraw her complaint, a heartbreaking end to a once-admired marriage. In interviews with the media, Mr. Fu continued to assert his belief in an affair between his ex-wife and Fang Sun. According to him, the divorce was merely a carefully staged performance to allow the two to be together. However, the following developments contradicted public expectations. Not only did they fail to come together, but Mrs. Zhong and Fang Sun's relationship also took an even darker turn. The turning point came in 2019, when Mrs. Zhong made a series of decisions to sell valuable assets and resign from her director roles at 4 of Sunbo's subsidiaries. Behind these moves was the story of her falling out with co-founder Fang Sun, as the company faced continuous losses, forcing the liquidation of precious assets. The most significant loss was Carrick Vineyard, an 85-acre organic estate that she cherished deeply. It was not just any farm, it was a complete complex with a winery, wine cellar, and fine dining restaurant, all of which represented Mrs. Zhong's passion and dedication over the years. Close associates revealed that at that time, Mrs. Zhong was facing enormous financial pressure after a string of business failures. The burden grew heavier as Fang Sun, instead of offering empathy and support, blamed all failures on her poor management. The tension between the two reached its peak in August 2019 when Fang Sun suddenly filed a lawsuit in court. The lawsuit, like a devastating blow, accused Mrs. Zhong caused financial losses of up to $14 million. Moreover, Fang Sun boldly demanded to take over the entire management of Sunbo, alleging that Mrs. Zhong owed the company $5.9 million. After investigation, New Zealand's court revealed that as of December 2019, Sunbo was carrying a debt of $9.8 million. Audit results showed that Mrs. Zhong had transferred $2.8 million from the company's account to her personal account. Despite the evidence, Mrs. Zhong denied embezzling company funds. She explained that while she had indeed transferred money to her personal account, she frequently used her own funds to pay company expenses, all in the interest of Sunbo's growth. She argued that the accountant had only noticed the funds transferred to her account without acknowledging the personal funds she had used for company expenses. Furthermore, Mrs. Zhong claimed that one of Sunbo's subsidiaries still owed her $7.3 million. A month later, the court ordered the liquidation of all jointly owned companies and the freezing of their largest business project, a different vineyard under early development. This marked the official end of their business partnership. After gathering the above information, the police focused their investigation on 2 individuals, Mr. Fu, her ex-husband, and Fang Sun, her former business partner. Both were closely connected to Mrs. Zhong, involving both personal and financial matters. However, after questioning and investigation, the police determined that the relationship between Mrs. Zhong and Mr. Fu had not reached a level where he would harm her. Moreover, Mr. Fu had remarried after the divorce and had a clear alibi. Mr. Fu also shared that despite the divorce, they remained like family due to their shared custody of pets, even co-parenting 2 dogs. 6 months before the tragedy, Mr. Fu had visited Mrs. Zhong's house, where she confided about escalating conflicts with Fang Sun. As a mutual friend, Mr. Fu had once tried to mediate between them. He also disclosed that during a private meeting, Fang Sun had once threatened that if Mrs. Zhong did not repay the borrowed money, he would go after her family, including Mr. Fu. The police then shifted their focus to Fang Sun, who was 8 years younger than Mrs. Zhong. However, when faced with tough questions, Fang Sun offered unexpected explanations. He openly admitted his deep hatred for Mrs. Zhong following significant financial losses. But he argued that killing her would not solve anything and would only make matters worse. His lost money would still not be recovered. Additionally, Fang Sun revealed that Mrs. Zhong had another romantic relationship with a younger man who was also heavily indebted to her. Mrs. Zhong didn't remain single for long after her divorce from Fang Sun. At a Chinese community event, she met Kai Wei Zheng, a young and handsome recent immigrant to New Zealand. The two quickly developed feelings for each other and officially started dating. Within 6 months, sharing a passion for filmmaking, they launched a film company called Passion Picture Group with an initial investment of $28,000 from Mrs. Zhong. During a trip to China, Mrs. Zhong transferred $14,000, which she inherited from her late father, to Kai's bank account. However, the COVID-19 pandemic led to a freeze in the film industry, leaving their film company in crisis. By March 2020, when New Zealand imposed a nationwide lockdown due to the pandemic, Mrs. Zhong invited Kai to live with her to alleviate the fear of being alone. They lived together until a few weeks before the tragedy, when Kai moved out. The relationship between Mrs. Zhong and Fang Sun had completely deteriorated amidst ongoing legal disputes. Their financial situation worsened, and Mrs. Zhong faced mounting losses, pushing her closer to bankruptcy. In this dire situation, Mrs. Zhong's daughter took action to recover the $14,000 her mother had previously lent to Kai. Despite her desperate pleas, Kai made weak excuses, claiming his bank account was locked and he could not transfer the funds. When summoned by the police, Kai explained that he had no reason to harm Mrs. Zhong, citing his stable financial situation and ownership of 3 properties. He stated, "Why would I kill someone over $14,000? He also provided a solid alibi, showing that he had been in Ruatoria on New Zealand's east coast for industrial hemp training during the time of the incident. On November 27th, he returned to Auckland and learned of Mrs. Zhong's disappearance the next day. The police believed Kai's account and ruled him out as a suspect. At this point, all suspicion shifted back to Fang Sun. Mrs. Wu told the police that Mrs. Zhong had been threatened multiple times before her death. Several neighbors also reported seeing an Asian man frequently driving around Mrs. Zhong's house recently, seemingly monitoring her every move. Further investigation revealed that after the collapse of Sunbo, all their assets were auctioned. Fang Sun was evicted by his wife and moved to a house just a few hundred feet from Mrs. Zhong's mansion. Most of his business funds had been borrowed from friends, leaving him not only financially ruined, but also discredited within the business community. His life spiraled into a vicious cycle. During the day, he scrambled to deal with debts and legal proceedings, while at night, he was tormented by relentless calls from creditors. Overwhelmed from all sides, his mental and physical state deteriorated rapidly. Realizing that Mrs. Zhong was unable to repay the substantial debt, Fang Sun began to plot revenge. Despite his financial woes, he was willing to pay $200 per hour to hire 4 detectives to track Mrs. Zhong's every move. The man hired for the job was Jun Jin, known as Jimmy, a former schoolmate of Fang Sun and a retired police detective from China. After purchasing modern surveillance equipment online, Jimmy cleverly attached it to the undercarriage of Mrs. Zhong's car. Since July 2020, Jimmy had been reporting back to Fang Sun. Just 2 days before the tragedy, Jimmy discovered Mrs. Zhong driving alone to a casino in Auckland. Curious about this visit, he delved deeper and found that she had visited the casino 381 times in the past 4 years. This revelation not only served as a statistic, but also exposed a dark side to the life of the successful businesswoman. Mrs. Zhong had become a full-fledged gambling addict. Jimmy immediately relayed this information to Fang Sun, unaware that it could be the final straw that triggered the impending tragedy. On the morning of the murder, Jimmy received a message from Fang Sun instructing him to stay away from Mrs. Zhong's house due to heavy police presence. Jimmy assumed Mrs. Zhong had fled due to her debts. However, he realized the tracking device was still on her car and needed to be removed to avoid police detection. Checking the surveillance cameras, Jimmy saw Fang Sun's car parked nearby, so he drove over, circling around the area discreetly and waiting for a moment when there were no people around to remove the tracking device from the underside of Mrs. Zhong's car. Early the next morning, Jimmy met with Fang Sun at a McDonald's restaurant. Fang Sun reiterated that Mrs. Zhong had been gambling frequently and emphasized that she had won a significant amount of money the day before. What struck Jimmy as odd was that Fang Sun insisted on erasing all the data from the tracking device, but Jimmy refused to comply. This decision later proved to be the right one, as news of Mrs. Zhong's tragic death broke later that same day, prompting Jimmy to immediately suspect Fang Sun. The police searched Fang Sun's residence and discovered a detailed diagram of Mrs. Zhong's house, marked with specific locations for security cameras. However, there were 12 distinct fingerprints on the document, none of which belonged to Fang Sun. Investigators continued to examine surveillance footage from around Mrs. Zhong's house and found that at approximately 3:38 a.m. on the day of the incident, a man was seen near her home. At 4:26 a.m., Mrs. Zhong's phone was turned off, and its signal was lost entirely. By 7:48 a.m., multiple street cameras captured images of Mrs. Zhong's Range Rover driving away. Based on this information, the police developed a theory. Fang Sun may have secretly entered Mrs. Zhong's home, leading to a heated argument and a violent struggle. He allegedly stabbed Mrs. Zhong multiple times, causing her death. After committing the crime, Fang Sun took her phone, laptop, data storage devices, and security cameras, dumping them in a nearby landfill. At 8:05 a.m., surveillance footage captured the Range Rover returning. 3 minutes later, a figure was seen walking from the direction of the landfill toward Fang Sun's home. Over a year after the tragedy, on April 26, 2021, the highly publicized trial commenced at the Auckland City Court. Mrs. Wu, a close friend of the victim, testified that Mrs. Zhong had reported threats from Fang Sun to the police multiple times, explaining why she had called the police that fateful day when she sensed imminent danger. Mrs. Wu's testimony was corroborated by other friends of Mrs. Zhong, who confirmed that Fang Sun had openly threatened to end Mrs. Zhong's life. Despite being confronted with overwhelming evidence, Fang Sun stubbornly denied all charges. However, DNA analysis revealed a match between the DNA found under Mrs. Zhong's fingernails and Fang Sun's DNA. In response, Fang Sun offered a weak explanation, claiming that the DNA transfer could have occurred when his son inadvertently touched Mrs. Zhong's belongings while they were living in her house. This flimsy defense failed to sway the jury. The final verdict was delivered. Fang Sun was sentenced to life imprisonment, with the possibility of parole only after serving 18 years and 6 months. Looking back at Mrs. Zhong's life, it is a tale of highs and lows. From a young, independent woman who climbed her way to success and wealth through sheer talent and effort, she became a successful businesswoman admired by many. Tragically, her life ended unjustly at the hands of her lover. As for Fang Sun, it is likely that his resentment toward Mrs. Zhong had festered for a long time, reaching a breaking point when he discovered that she had not only deceived him, but had also gambled away the substantial funds he had painstakingly accumulated over the years. And that concludes today's story. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.